John Cape, who's joining us. He's talking to us about global warming, climate change, and this is our 1.2 version. We're going to take a look at John's slideshow where we left off. I can find the slideshow. I think this is it where we left off with the table synopsis from version 1, and then we are going into section 2. John, this gets more complicated.
Well, actually, I decided to change the order of the slides. Typically, this would be one of my very early slides because this is a very, very important point. This slide shows both carbon dioxide and temperature based upon the best guesses of science. And this is over the last 600 million years. And so if you look at the upper left, you see the black line at the top, which is carbon dioxide. And it's about 15 to 20 times higher than what it is now. And you see over time that carbon dioxide levels have come down. But you note the temperature, which is in blue, and the axis to temperature is on the right axis. The temperature and carbon dioxide aren't very closely related. 80% of life on Earth in the last 4.5 billion years, 80% of the time there has been no ice. So Earth has mostly been a hothouse planet. And this graph kind of supports that. You look at 25 degrees, it's kind of like when the Earth is running sort of at a full rate. And then an ice age, even when carbon dioxide was well above 4,000, which is more than 10 times the current carbon dioxide levels, there was an ice age. And so to believe now that carbon dioxide is like the thermostat of the planet isn't supported by the historical temperature record. And this table is pretty well accepted. This isn't something that's considered esoteric. This is something that a lot of these climate scientists accept this table. And so the other piece of this particular slide that's very, very interesting, if you look at where carbon dioxide is now, the current carbon dioxide level is somewhere around 410 parts per million. And before it started increasing, mostly with the little ice age, and somewhat, it started also increasing along with the addition of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere back after World War II. But you know, the carbon dioxide at one point in time back in the 1700s was like 280. So we're at 400. It's increased a little bit. But if carbon dioxide actually gets to as low as 150 parts per million, plants stop growing. And so the fact that during the last glaciation period, which is from about 100,000 years ago to 14,000 years ago, carbon dioxide got as low as 180 parts per million. It was almost to the starvation level for plants. And so right now, you know, plants grow a hell of a lot better with more carbon dioxide. At 1,600 parts per million, maybe the optimal level for plants. That would be 4 times the current carbon dioxide concentration. But right now we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And as we do so, it actually may be extending life on planet Earth. And the reason that carbon dioxide has gone missing, there are generally 2 different stories that are told. One of them has to do with little sea creatures. And the sea creatures, you know, are shellfish that create their shellfish from carbon carbonate, which comes from carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean water. And when those shellfish die, a lot of the shellfish go into the ocean mud. That mud gets covered with more shellfish, and eventually that gets sequestered and becomes rocks. And so Mother Nature is responsible for how this carbon dioxide got to such low levels that we see right now. So there's some great material by a number of different people that talk about this phenomenon. William Hopper talks about it as one source, and then a book that I got recently. Excuse me for 1 second, but yes. I'm gonna give a commercial for this guy, and it's this one here. This is from a guy that used to be one of the founders of Greenpeace, and his name is Patrick Moore. And Patrick Moore wrote this book called Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. The entire 3rd chapter of this book talks about this phenomenon, how Mother Nature basically has been sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that if we don't increase it, the planet is going to die. And so to argue that carbon dioxide is harmful is actually very counter to perhaps what may in fact be in the best interest of our planet. We can all debate this, but it's never discussed by the narrative. It's never brought up by people that are trying to sell us on a different viewpoint. His theory, like everybody else's, is ignored. If you want to get a taste of what this shows, take a look at a paper called Shouldn't We Celebrate Carbon Dioxide? You can Google that and it'll bring up Patrick Moore's paper talking about this phenomenon related to small creatures.
And then, John, of course, plants produce oxygen for us, right? Is that
right,
correct?
right. If plants die, the planet dies. So at 150 parts per million, we're at danger of just wiping out known life on Earth.
And what is our level right now?
Carbon dioxide is 0.0, maybe 0.041% of the atmosphere are basically 4 parts per 10,000 molecules.
But you mentioned 150 parts per million.
Yeah, if it gets to that level. That.
But so what are we? Where are we in relationship to this 150 parts per?
We're at 400.
So we're well ahead. We're well ahead.
We're higher now, but we were as low as 180 during the last glaciation period. Okay. It went down that low, and so we need to understand that carbon dioxide has a lot of very positive purposes, and before we take on schemes trying to suck all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we need to be very much smarter about it.
But again, I don't want to take it on a rabbit hole, but so carbon dioxide does encourage plant life, which then encourages the production of oxygen. We had somebody on for another topic of fashion designer Vivienne Westwood, and you can find her online ranting about, in a positive way, I like Vivienne, about climate change, and she said that the oxygen level is a concern.
The oxygen level is 21% of the atmosphere.
But is it a concern? Is it below? No, is it getting below a certain threshold level for us?
Not at all. It's 21% of the atmosphere. Compare that to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is 0.4% of the atmosphere. If you do the math, it's basically what, 5,000 times higher?
But is there a threshold, like just like the threat of plant life based on carbon dioxide? Is there a threshold that oxygen does there need to be 25% or more for human life to be sustained on this planet of oxygen? Is there a concern about falling below a threshold level of percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere?
I don't think so. The amount of oxygen, the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere, neither are greenhouse gases. It's pretty constant. And okay. So that shouldn't be fair. When we breathe out carbon dioxide, we actually breathe out about 4% carbon dioxide. So we breathe out 100 times as much carbon dioxide concentration as we breathe in. So if you're in a classroom, for example, and I've seen this done before, someone says, well, let me read the carbon dioxide in this atmosphere. And it's not unusual for that classroom to have 1,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide, because all the people in the room are breathing out, they're breathing out 4% carbon dioxide. And it's just what it is. And submarines, I think submarines can actually have like maybe 0.5%. So they can be 10 or 11 times as high on carbon dioxide as we allow on the atmosphere.
That's very interesting, John, because I think we think that it's always constant wherever we are at all times. We don't think of your immediate environment having different levels than the outside world. That's very fascinating.
Yeah, it does actually. Okay, this is a quote from Steve Coonan, and Steve Coonan was the science advisor to former President Obama. And what he says is that advocating that we only make low-risk changes until we have a better understanding of why the climate is changing and how it might change in the future is a stance some might call waffling, but I'd prefer the term realistic and prudent. I can respect the opinions of others who might come to different conclusions, as I hope they would respect mine. Those differences can be resolved if we realize they're ultimately about values and not about the science. And now, since Steve Coonan has produced this book in 2021, and I found out about it from the Wall Street Journal, who did an editorial on him, and I ordered it immediately and read it. And it's a pretty good book, but it just says basically the science is, as the title says, unsettled. There's a lot of uncertainty here. And instead of jumping up and doing what's called mitigation, instead of us jumping up and trying to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, we should wait. We should be patient. We should focus on adaptation. If warming ever actually happens, which in this case may actually not be the case, then you take appropriate action at that point in time. If something else happens, you fix it then, but you don't try to spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars now trying to reduce carbon dioxide, only to learn out later we kind of needed it to help us with plant life on the planet. And so there's just too much uncertainty in these narratives, and they should not be telling you the science is settled or the science is closed. Science doesn't do that.
But John, don't you think this is really outmoded, outdated, this idea of ultimately it's about values, not about the science? Because don't you think, like you mentioned, the science being like a religion, science really is the overriding narrative here, don't you think?
Well, but he's a scientist. He's a very good scientist. And he just felt it important to kind of set the record straight, that he's not recommending we go off doing net zero at this point in time. We should not be spending all this money until we actually have more certainty in what we're doing and why. And so he's just saying that, what people are advocating is not science. You're not getting the benefit of science. You're getting their opinion. And he says those are values. And their values may be their religious values, that they need to punish mankind for the sin of improving their material well-being or their lifestyle with fossil fuels. When I think about religion, I think about like I was in Mexico and they showed this temple that faced this temple of the sun, and they said people were sacrificed. They had their hearts ripped out on this temple, and then they would hold the heart up in the air, and then the sun would come up, and they say, yes, that heart just brought the sun up. We're not more advanced than that. We're kind of about the same mind frame, that basically we're using religious fervor trying to make what should be scientific decisions. And Europe has paid for this dearly. Australia has paid for this dearly. And I've seen that if Europe had actually spent the same amount of money to build nuclear power plants, they would already have 100% their electricity system from nuclear power plants. Instead, they've got this unreliable system that's having blackouts. They've got all kinds of problems. They've got a lot of energy poverty. A lot of poor people can't afford energy anymore. They're riding around town on buses at night because the buses are heated and their homes are not, because they can't afford to pay for it. So there's a lot of moving parts to this thing. When the United Nations tells Africa they can't build a coal power plant, they're preventing them from having the same step-ups that we had in our country that made us, get away from poverty, made us more successful. And yet we're dictating this to the poorest countries in the world. That's why India and China are telling us to just step aside. They're gonna improve the well-being of their people, and they've made tremendous progress.
Well, and the well-being of the people would be driven by values. So that's leadership. So that's the difference. I mean, we really reneged on our leadership. Leaders have reneged on their role to make decisions based on the values that to benefit most people, most places, and most times in favor of science. So it's a cop-out, basically.
I think that's true. Okay, this is another quote from a guy that used to be sort of on the alarmist side. And the more he studied it, he's from Denmark, and the more he studied it, he got a little bit more critical of what's going on. He's got some harsh words here. So I'm going to go ahead and read a lot of what he said. He says, 30 years of climate policy have failed to rein in temperature rises or reduce carbon intensity. The amount of carbon dioxide we emit for every unit of energy produced. All the well-meaning personal actions undertaken in the rich world, like buying electric cars or becoming vegetarians, amount to little more than gestures. Far more importantly, the Paris Agreement has put us collectively on a pathway towards incurring gigantic costs, especially for the poorest, with next to no climate benefit. Thus far, humanity has excelled at showing how not to fix the climate. We've spent 3 decades trying the same deeply broken approach over and over. Politicians lurch from one climate summit to the next, with climate campaigners urging them on to make even more ludicrous promises. Enough is enough. So Bjorn Lomborg, I would say he's one of these guys that still kind of believes that carbon dioxide drives warming. But he's very strong that basically the mitigation approach the approach trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions has been an own goal. It's been a failure and has given nobody a benefit. It's just wasted a tremendous amount of money and harmed a lot of very poor people mostly. And when someone goes from the alarmist side to our side and tries to give us these words of wisdom, I think we should be listening to that. Now, once again, I'm sure the narrative has kicked him out of their club. And so they'll find a way to shut down your ability to access his materials. But that's what passes for protection of science these days.
Yeah, that's very sad. Twice now you've mentioned that the most vulnerable people, the poorest people, are often the victims of these bad policies. That's a great talking point. I mean, it's an unfortunate talking point, but I think it's an important one to keep mentioning.
Yeah. This chart here is a chart that it's really hard to find. And what this shows, if you remember that temperature carbon dioxide graph I showed you, where carbon dioxide went diagonally from the upper left to the lower right, and the temperature stayed temperature stayed like 25 degrees, then you'd have an ice age, 25 degrees, ice age, 25 degrees, ice age. When they were at 25 degrees, they basically had the temperature pattern we see here for the mid-Cretaceous, which is a geological age that ended about, I think, about 65 million years ago. And what this means is, based upon latitude, is that the temperature of present day in these latitudes is not much different than the temperature was at mid-Cretaceous. The big difference happened at upper latitudes. And so the average temperature here was about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The average temperature today is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And the difference is we have ice on our poles, ice on Antarctica, ice on the North Pole, and the Cretaceous, they didn't. And so they had a lot more land that had a lot more moderate temperatures that were actually livable places to live. And so if warming would in fact somehow kick into where it used to be in the Cretaceous, it wouldn't at all probably be a problem for a place like Houston. We'd have a very similar temperature. Alaska would be a great place to live suddenly. The glaciers would probably go away fairly quickly, and you'd have a lot of arable land up here. You'd have a lot of arable land in Canada, just a lot more of the planet would be hospitable for mankind if that were to actually occur, which is what we're told the risk is. So this is a fascinating kind of a comparison that we never hear about as well. This is not shared as part of the narrative, that basically the way the world warms up is not just that, we're pretending we're Venus on the equator. No, it's pretty similar on the equator. It's all happening at the higher latitudes.
That's very interesting. That's very conceptual, John. It's the idea you mentioned writing your novel. It's the idea that we don't know where we are in the story. It's very interesting.
Exactly. Now this next slide is, this is from a Dr. Roy Spencer. Now he kind of works with the satellite program in Alabama as well. And he's produced this UAI satellite-based temperature data of the global lower atmosphere. And what he shows are what I refer to as oscillations. If you think about El Nino or El Nina, El Nino is a change in the Pacific temperature that causes certain things in the United States. El Nina is sort of a wet reversal of that. And so we see these spikes that are going up. That's not carbon dioxide driving that. Those are natural variations. And so when you look at this chart and they say 2016 has the hottest temperature ever, that's at the very top of a natural variation, which is the El Nino. 2020, same thing. The top of that variation, top of that oscillation was El Nino. And the fascinating thing is, about 4 or 5 months ago, the entire El Nino fell off. And we are now down below zero on that chart. And so I highlighted June 2021 is a minus 0.01 degrees Celsius. And so if you were to compare that location versus where we were in 1979, there hasn't been much warming whatsoever. And so when people start telling you there's warming, ask them, are you comparing the lowest trough to the highest oscillation point? Are you comparing sort of the mid-range of all these? And there's some other interesting theories that I won't go into today that have to do with things like solar sunspots and cosmic rays, all kind of other things that we never hear about in the narrative, but actually have some fascinating science associated with it. And the world, this is a average global warming temperature coming from a satellite. So it's a pretty accurate reading. And the whole globe is cooler now than it was just 4 or 5 months ago, dramatically cooler. And yet we don't hear about this. What do we hear about? We hear about droughts in the Northwest, record temperatures. It's like a hide the bacon comment. They're trying to sort of redirect our attention away from what's really kind of critical data toward data that's more superfluous.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just, I think, one of the best examples I have. And I'd recommend you go to this website. Just type in Roy Spencer temperature, and you can read his blog about what global warming is and what it's not. And he's got some interesting materials there. And every month he updates this number. And I like wait for it. You know, it'll show up about the second or third day of the month, and I'll be looking for it to see how we're doing. And but this is good stuff.
Well, John, in this entire topic, though, don't you think the challenge and the opportunity is that, you know, if you offer a counter narrative to global climate change, you know, you're gonna set yourself up for criticism and probably ridicule, because basically you're announcing that you're just not buying the party line. But
Right.
the opportunity of that is many people are not buying the party line, so it's a challenge and an opportunity at the same time.
I think so. I mean, there are some great presentations out there. I mean, Steve Gorham's got some really good stuff. William Happer has some really good stuff out there. And William Happer is more technical than anybody I know. He's a physicist and has some brilliant insights as far as, you know, frequencies and what radiation does carbon dioxide emit, you know, energy back into space. And there's a number of other great presentations, but most people just can't find it. So my book, I'm hoping, will be a vehicle to knowledge. I'm hoping to point you toward some of these guys that really have made very compelling contributions to science, and they have been brutally attacked. Many people have lost tenure, or not been able to get tenure because they weren't of the right tribe. And the peer-reviewed articles don't necessarily favor those that aren't telling the story they're supposed to tell. I mean, why would anybody want to pee on the research grant bandwagon if it's giving a lot of money to these climate scientists to live the good life and fly around to global conferences? And, you know, who's actually responsible for all this? I don't know exactly, but I think there are certainly the logical suspects. Who would be interested in the U.S. getting economically destroyed? Who would benefit from that? Ask that question.
Well,
and I think you'll get an interesting answer.
Earlier today, I had somebody in the office who's kind of somebody who crossed over. He was a lifelong Democrat, and he said he used to watch CNN and get all his news from NPR. And I asked him, I said, well, what does all this mean? And he said, well, it's a power grab. It's all about to control people. It's an assault on freedom, and it's to demoralize people. So, you know, I think this is a very interesting topic, but that's, in all the topics we look at, that is kind of the overall arching theme. So even besides the topic of global climate change, that is the overarching theme that we're talking about. So when you say you're against or you're not buying this narrative, you're setting yourself up as being counter to the whole narrative. And I'm thinking we're saying we're against the power grab. We're not interested in giving up on our personal freedoms. Many people, I don't want to get into the topic of the pandemic, but many people have told me that they think the next pandemic lockdown is going to be revolving around climate change. If that's the next thing they're going to tell us, is that we have to close down again, shut down in order to save the planet. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to sort of wake up, to realize that this train they put us on is taking us no place that we want to live. And I think it's very important that we start recognizing that our unwillingness to challenge the narrative, our unwillingness to challenge the political correctness, and allow these guys to continue to just victimize anyone who wants to offer any counter opinion. That's not science. And we should not.
It's about something else.
It's not science. Scientists don't behave like that. Scientists are about criticism. They're about making a hypothesis and finding ways to disprove that hypothesis. A great book I really enjoyed reading was Michael Crichton, and it's called State of Fear. And he was a very big proponent of being a climate. But he was a great proponent against this narrative for climate change. And he's got a perfect example back in the notes of that book. And he says, you know, there was a movement where all the scientists agreed, the major foundations were funding it, the media was supporting it, and most people believed it to be true. And it was called eugenics. And Hitler used it to kill, Hitler used it to kill Jews.
Yes.
And this is not very distant to what went on with eugenics.
Yes.
This kind of disinformation
Yes.
is something that we need to set straight, or it's going to cause huge, huge economic consequences for not just the only superpower in the world right now, but for the economic welfare of anyone that will ever be associated with this country in any capacity. This is very, very dangerous stuff we're allowing these guys to play with. And we need to stand up collectively to kind of look at each of their data points and better yet, look at what they're not telling us. And that's what I hope my novel can help do, is illuminate that a little bit to give people an idea of where to look for better information.
Well, that is quite an admirable mission, John. I think that I wish you luck in that. Actually, I don't wish you more than luck. I sincerely think you'll succeed in that.
No, they're gonna trash me pretty badly. It's like a little mouse, you know, that kind of has the eagle about to eat him, and he gives the bird the finger, you know, because it's about to curve away. This is a nasty element that's going to come after me if we want to release this. And I just hope the book actually finds a way to still get out. It's going to need some support.
Well, let us know how we can help you. And I do appreciate, John, you're sharing this all with us today for the Climate Change Part 2. And we look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for inviting me.